You are completely alone. The ship is gone. The people you were travelling with are gone. The ocean, which was supposed to be a backdrop to your vacation, or your cargo run, or whatever perfectly reasonable thing you were doing, has swallowed everything except you. You've washed up on a beach that has no roads, no buildings, no cell towers, no other humans, and absolutely no interest in your survival. The palm trees are beautiful, by the way. Really stunning. You're going to hate them within a week. Here's the thing about the castaway fantasy that movies have sold us so effectively. The one where a resourceful, slightly scruffy protagonist builds a shelter, catches fish with their bare hands, and eventually gets rescued looking rugged and enlightened. It has almost nothing to do with the actual experience. The actual experience begins with panic, confusion, probable injury, and the creeping, nauseating realization that nobody knows exactly where you are. And even if they did, the math is not in your favour. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. Now, back to your island. Let's establish something important up front. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a thought experiment cooked up for the internet. Human beings have genuinely survived alone on uninhabited islands for extraordinary stretches of time, and the records they left behind are equal parts inspiring and deeply unsettling. The most famous example is Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor who was marooned on Juan Fernandez Island in September of 1704, not by shipwreck, but by his own stubborn insistence that the ship he was on was unseaworthy. He demanded to be left behind. His crewmates obliged. The ship he refused to sail on later sank, which meant Selkirk was technically right. But he was also standing alone on an island in the South Pacific watching his only ride to civilization disappear over the horizon. So the victory was complicated. He stayed there, entirely alone, for 4 years and 4 months, until he was finally rescued on February 2nd, 1709. His story became one of the inspirations for Robinson Crusoe. He got a book deal out of it, essentially. But 4 years and 4 months is a long time to wait for your book deal. The reason Selkirk's story matters for our purposes is that it proves survival is possible. But before we get to the how, we need to be honest about the before, because most people in a shipwreck scenario never even make it to the island. A Swedish analysis examining 18 maritime disasters spanning from the 1850s all the way to 2011 found that the average survival rate was roughly 40% for men and around 30% for women. Those numbers should sit with you for a moment. You're not starting this survival story from a place of comfort or preparation. You're starting it as one of the lucky ones, or unlucky ones, depending on how the next few weeks go, who actually made it to shore. You've already beaten odds that a significant portion of people didn't. Your body has likely been battered by waves, possibly submerged in cold salt water for an extended period, and your decision-making is operating on adrenaline and shock, which is precisely the worst possible time to be making decisions. This is what survival experts call the first wave of reality. Not a metaphorical wave, though there are those too, but the immediate cascade of problems that demand your attention the moment you stop moving in the water and start moving on land. Panic is the first passenger. It arrives without luggage and takes up enormous space. Your heart rate is elevated. Your breathing is shallow. Your brain is scanning for threats in every direction, because every direction looks equally threatening and equally unfamiliar. If you were injured during the wreck, and statistically there's a reasonable chance something hurts, salt water has been in the wound, which is its own conversation. You may have swallowed seawater. You're almost certainly dehydrated despite having been completely surrounded by water, which is one of survival's more cruel jokes. The single most important thing you can do in those first minutes, before any shelter, before any food, before any signal fire or clever tool-making, is stop making bad decisions. That sounds almost insultingly simple. It is not simple. When fear is running the show, the brain desperately wants to do something, anything, to feel like it has agency. People run into forests without knowing what's in them. People drink seawater. People exhaust themselves trying to flag down ships that aren't there. The instinct to act is strong, but undirected action in a survival situation can be as dangerous as doing nothing. So here's what this video is actually going to cover, because we're not here just to describe the nightmare. We're here to think through it seriously. We're going to look at what real castaways actually did, not the Hollywood version, but the historical record. What Selkirk ate, how he built shelter, what tools he improvised from basically nothing, and what nearly broke him psychologically before he found his footing. We're going to walk through the practical survival priorities for your first month on an island: water, food, shelter, fire, and signalling, in the order they actually matter, not the order that looks best on a survival show. And then we're going to spend time on something most survival content skips almost entirely: what happens inside your head during extended isolation, and why the mind can collapse long before the body does. Because here's the part that the fantasy version never tells you. The island doesn't care about your resourcefulness. The weather doesn't care that you watched every episode of Survivor. The hunger and the loneliness and the days that blur into weeks that blur into something you stop counting because counting makes it worse. None of that cares about your intentions. What determines whether you make it isn't just skill. It's something more complicated and more interesting than that. Selkirk made it. And the way he did it wasn't just about goats and wild turnips, though there were absolutely goats and wild turnips involved. It was about something happening in his head that kept him moving when every reasonable instinct told him to stop. Let's talk about that. So let's start with what Selkirk actually had when the boat disappeared. Because the romantic image of a castaway, resourceful, bare-handed, wresting survival from pure wilderness, skips over a crucial detail. He wasn't dropped onto that island with nothing. The crew left him with a musket, a hatchet, a knife, a cooking pot, a Bible, bedding and clothing. That's not nothing. That's actually a reasonable starter kit, and it still almost destroyed him. The early weeks were, by most accounts, genuinely terrible. Juan Fernandez Island, a volcanic, heavily forested chunk of land sitting off the coast of Chile, is not hostile in the way that a desert is hostile. It has fresh water, it has food, it has timber. What it doesn't have is any other human being, and that absence hit Selkirk like a physical blow. He reportedly spent his first weeks on the beach, unable to move inland, watching the horizon for ships that never came. The psychological freefall of those early weeks nearly finished him before the island got a chance to. We'll come back to that part. But at some point, and this is the critical turn in his story, he stopped waiting for the world to save him and started making decisions as though it wouldn't. The first decision that mattered was food. The island had feral goats, descendants of animals left by earlier Spanish sailors, and they became Selkirk's primary lifeline. He hunted them with his musket initially, but musket ammunition is finite, and Selkirk understood early that burning through powder and shot on every meal was a death sentence in slow motion. So he started chasing them on foot. Over months of running through the island's terrain, he reportedly became fast enough to catch goats by hand, a detail that sounds like pure embellishment, and may well have been polished a bit in the telling, since most of what we know about Selkirk comes from 18th century accounts that had every reason to dramatise. But even if the details were sharpened for an audience, the underlying truth holds. He adapted his hunting methods to preserve his resources. He also milked the goats he kept alive, which gave him a reliable source of fat and protein that turned out to be critically important, for a reason he probably didn't fully understand at the time. Fresh goat meat and milk contain vitamin C. Without that on an island diet, scurvy would have been waiting for him. It was, in effect, an accidental nutritional solution to a problem he didn't know he was solving. He supplemented the goats with plants, wild turnips, which grew across the island, the leaves of what was known as the cabbage tree, and the fruits of the pink peppercorn tree, small, bright, and apparently palatable enough to be worth picking. None of this was gourmet. All of it was sustainable. There's something almost methodical about the way Selkirk catalogued what the island could offer, turning a fixed piece of land into a functioning larder through observation and trial, which, again, keeping the storytelling caveat in mind, suggests a man who had made a psychological decision to survive rather than merely endure. His shelter tells the same story. He built 2 huts from the wood of pepper trees, and the fact that he built 2 of them is worth pausing on. One was for cooking, one was for sleeping. That division of space is not a trivial detail. It reflects a deliberate effort to impose domestic structure on chaos, to create an environment that had rooms, that had purpose, that felt less like wilderness and more like something he controlled. The cooking fire's smoke and smell stays out of the sleeping space. The sleeping space stays cleaner, quieter, more conducive to rest. That separation of function is something a person does when they've decided to live there, not just survive there. It's a small thing that quietly signals an enormous mental shift. The toolmaking is where Selkirk's story becomes genuinely impressive. His knife, the one the crew left him with, eventually wore down or broke, as blades do under heavy use. Rather than losing a critical tool and slowly losing his capacity to function without it, he took barrel hoops from the wreckage and debris he'd collected on the beach and forged himself a replacement. Forged from barrel hoops. This man was a sailor, not a blacksmith, which means he figured out a metalworking process from first principles on a remote island, because the alternative was losing the ability to skin and butcher animals. The accounts don't detail exactly how he managed it. Open fire, improvised bellows, stone anvils presumably. But the outcome was real enough that he still had functional blades when rescuers eventually found him. If there's a single detail in Selkirk's story that crystallizes why he survived, it might be this one. He didn't accept the loss of a tool as a permanent condition. He treated it as a problem that required a solution. By the time the Duke and the Duchess sailed past Juan Fernandez Island in early 1709, the man who came out of the forest to meet them was reportedly unrecognizable from the sailor who'd been marooned 4.5 years earlier. He was wearing clothes made from goat skin. He moved differently, faster, more confidently through terrain that would have been impenetrable to the men who came ashore to collect him. He had built a life of sorts, on an island that had no interest in hosting one. It's worth briefly pulling the lens back to acknowledge that Selkirk's story is one flavour of castaway survival, and not the only one. José Alvarenga's case offers a dramatically different version of the same fundamental nightmare. In 2012, Alvarenga set out on a fishing trip from Mexico and got caught in a storm that destroyed his engine and pushed him off course into open ocean. He drifted for 438 days across the Pacific, roughly 6,700 miles, before washing ashore in the Marshall Islands. No island, no fresh water source, no goats. His survival depended on catching rain, eating raw fish and sea turtles, and drinking turtle blood when rain didn't come. He lost a companion who gave up eating and died partway through the ordeal. Alvarenga kept going anyway, talking to himself, talking to God, talking to the fish, doing whatever it took to keep his mind somewhere other than the void. He arrived in the Marshall Islands malnourished and barely functional, but alive. The contrast matters because it illustrates something important. There's no single castaway playbook. Selkirk had a fixed island with resources he could inventory and exploit systematically. Alvarenga had nothing fixed, no land, no shelter, no knowable food supply, and survived through relentless improvisation and, by his own account, sheer refusal to stop. Their circumstances were almost opposite, and they both made it. What they shared wasn't technique. It was a decision made at some point in the worst of it that they were going to keep doing the next thing. Whatever the next thing was, they were going to do it. That decision, and when it happens and what it costs, turns out to be more important than almost any survival skill you could memorize. Which brings us to the practical question of what your first month on that island actually looks like, moment by moment, priority by priority, before the psychological weight of it has fully landed on you. Because the first month is when the real choices get made. The first month is also, statistically, the most dangerous. Not because the island is trying to kill you harder in week 1 than week 4, but because your judgment is at its worst precisely when the decisions matter most. You're in shock. You're dehydrated, you're running on adrenaline that will eventually crash and leave you hollow. So before the crash comes, here is the sequence. Not a loose set of suggestions, but a ranked list of what kills you fastest if you ignore it. Water first, always water first. A human body in a tropical or subtropical environment, exerting itself, stressed, sweating. You're looking at potentially dangerous dehydration within 2 to 3 days. The ocean around you is completely useless for this. Salt water dehydrates you faster than nothing. So the moment you have your bearings, you're looking for 2 things: a fresh water source like a stream or spring, and a way to collect rain. The rain collection part is worth dwelling on, because it's not just practically critical, it's psychologically critical. Setting up a system to catch rainwater, even a crude one made from whatever container material you pulled from the wreck, is one of the first acts that gives you the feeling of agency over your situation. You're not just waiting for it to rain and hoping to catch some in your mouth. You're building infrastructure. You're doing something. That shift from passive victim to active problem solver happens faster than you'd expect once your hands are busy, And it turns out that feeling of control is one of the things that keeps people sane in conditions designed to break them. Shelter is second, and this is where a lot of survival instincts go wrong. People want to signal for rescue immediately, which is understandable, but exposure kills faster than hunger and almost as fast as thirst. On an island with sun, wind, and rain cycling through, your body is losing core regulation capacity if you don't have cover. In the first day or two, emergency cover means whatever you can make quickly. A lean-to from branches and leaves, a tarp from sailcloth salvaged from the wreck, anything that breaks the wind and keeps the rain off your head at night. This is not a permanent home. This is a biological necessity. Selkirk eventually built 2 proper huts from pepper tree wood, dividing his space into a cooking area and a sleeping area, but that came later, after the emergency was managed. The lesson from his example isn't to build furniture on day one. It's that shelter evolves. You start with what keeps you alive tonight, and you improve it as your situation stabilizes, because a better shelter isn't just warmer. It's another investment in permanence, another signal to your own brain that you're planning to be here long enough to deserve something sturdier. Fire is third, and it overlaps with shelter in importance because fire is shelter's most useful companion. It purifies water, it cooks food, it keeps predators away, and at night, on an empty island, it is the single most comforting object in the known universe. More relevantly for the practical side, a signal fire is one of your primary rescue tools, but only if you can keep the materials staged and ready to light fast when something appears on the horizon. A slow fire-starting process in the middle of the night, while a ship's lights are fading in the distance, is not a rescue scenario. It's a tragedy with extra steps. Food comes fourth, and this is where people's panic tends to redirect, because hunger is noisy in a way that dehydration isn't. The stomach demands attention. But here's the useful truth. A healthy adult can function reasonably well for 2 to 3 weeks on minimal calories, especially if water and rest are adequate. Hunger is not your emergency. Starvation is a slow process, which means you have time to learn your food sources rather than eating something poisonous in a desperate first-day scramble. The priorities in roughly descending order of reliability: fishing and shellfish gathering if you have coastline, which on an island you do, followed by trapping small animals with improvised snares, hunting feral animals if any exist on the island, and finally foraging plant life. That last one comes last for good reason. Misidentifying an edible plant as something toxic, or vice versa, is a real risk, and the conservative approach is to only eat plant material you can identify with high confidence or have tested cautiously in small amounts over time. If the island has animals, goats, birds, rats, anything, focus there first. Selkirk was fortunate that Juan Fernandez came pre-stocked with feral goats, but even without convenient livestock, coastal environments are typically protein-rich if you're willing to get patient and inventive with traps and lines. Tools and materials have to be managed from day one because the window to salvage useful items from a wreck is often short. Currents, tides, and wave action will redistribute and destroy what's left of the ship faster than you expect. Rope, metal components, cloth, containers, fasteners, all of it has value that compounds over the coming months. Selkirk's most remarkable improvisation was forging a new blade from barrel hoops when his original knife wore down, which tells you 2 things. First, that cutting tools are among the most important items you can have, and second, that their eventual failure should be anticipated, not mourned. Sharpen what you have carefully, use it deliberately rather than casually, and if you lose it, your job is to replace it, not despair over it. Physical health is the silent variable that undoes survivors who've otherwise done everything right. Exposure, sun and wind damage to skin, is a chronic problem that accumulates invisibly. Infection from cuts is serious without antibiotics and can escalate to life-threatening quickly, which means cleaning wounds with whatever is cleanest available, keeping them covered, and treating even minor injuries with more attention than you would at home. Exhaustion will be your constant companion, and fighting it stupidly, pushing through fatigue when rest is available, is a predictable way to make cascading errors in judgment. And then there's the nutritional dimension, which is less obvious but critically important over a month-long timeline. Vitamin C deficiency, scurvy, starts showing symptoms within 4 to 6 weeks on a diet without fresh produce or protein. Bleeding gums, fatigue, joint pain, and eventually worse. Selkirk almost certainly prevented this without knowing it, because fresh goat meat and goat milk contain vitamin C, and his reliance on the herd for food and milk was, nutritionally speaking, the right answer arrived at for the wrong reason. Fresh fish and shellfish also contain it. The takeaway is not to obsess over your micronutrient profile while also trying to survive, but to understand that the diet your body is telling you it wants, variety, freshness, protein, fat, is usually pointing you toward what it actually needs. Signaling runs in parallel to everything else. It doesn't replace shelter or water, but it shouldn't be deferred indefinitely either. A maintained signal fire, reflective materials arranged on a beach, any marker large enough to be visible from altitude. These are your connection to the world that doesn't know you exist yet. Here's what ties all of this together, and it's less a tip than a law of castaway physics. Every task you complete successfully makes the next one easier, and not just logistically. The water you collect, the fire you light, the shelter you improve, the fish you catch, each one changes something in your head. Action creates control, and control is the psychological state that separates people who make it through the first month from people who don't make it through the second week. The island doesn't get easier, you get better at it. And the gap between those two things is where survival actually lives. You've handled the physical side, you've collected water, built shelter, kept a fire going, caught something edible, and made it through your first month without dying from a preventable mistake. That is a genuine achievement. But here is the part that the survival manuals sometimes gloss over, the part that quietly determines whether all that practical competence actually adds up to rescue, or just a well-organized tragedy. Your mind is also on this island, and it has its own survival timeline, and it does not always cooperate. The psychological progression that researchers have documented in castaway cases follows a pattern that's almost grimly predictable. It starts with acute shock, the immediate cognitive disruption that follows the disaster itself, where your brain is running on pure adrenaline and your decision-making is simultaneously urgent and compromised. This fades, but what replaces it isn't relief. It's a prolonged anxiety phase, sometimes stretching weeks, where the reality of your situation begins to settle in without the numbing effect of crisis mode adrenaline. Then, for many castaways, comes something more dangerous than either of those: hopelessness. A slow, creeping sense that none of this matters because nobody is coming. And hopelessness, if it's allowed to take root, produces its most lethal offspring, passivity. Passivity is the one that actually kills you. Not the storm, not the hunger, not the infected cut on your heel. The decision, made quietly and without fanfare, to stop doing things. To sit on the beach and stare at the horizon instead of checking your fish traps. To skip the morning fire because what's the point? To stop repairing the shelter because it seems like an awful lot of effort for someone who's probably going to die here anyway. That internal voice sounds like realism, and it is not. It is a brain running out of perceived purpose, and if you let it run the show, it will manage your death far more efficiently than any external threat on the island could manage it for you. There's also the time distortion problem, which castaways describe in ways that sound almost poetic until you understand how disorienting it actually is. Days start blending together. The boundary between what happened yesterday and what happened 3 weeks ago dissolves. Past and future lose definition, leaving only an endless, undifferentiated present. This sounds peaceful in a meditation app kind of way. It is not. A person without a clear sense of time is a person whose grip on the future, on the idea that there is a future worth surviving toward, has started to loosen. And a loose grip on the future is the first symptom of a brain preparing to give up. So what do you actually do about it? The framework researchers have found most useful is called the hardiness model, developed in the late 1970s, and it rests on 3 things: perceived control, optimism, and treating change as a challenge rather than a verdict. The key word in the first one is perceived. You don't need actual control over your circumstances, because objectively speaking, your circumstances are terrible and largely out of your hands. What you need is the experience of controlling something, anything within them. This is why the practical tasks matter psychologically as much as they matter physically. When you haul in a fish, you didn't just feed yourself. You demonstrated to your own nervous system that your actions have consequences, that the island is a system you can interact with and influence. Every small win is a vote against passivity. Optimism doesn't mean telling yourself everything is fine when everything is obviously not fine. It means maintaining the working assumption that rescue is possible, that your actions increase its likelihood, and that the end of this story has not been written yet. This is a discipline, not a feeling. Feelings of optimism will come and go, often vanishing entirely on the days when it rains for 6 hours straight, and your fire goes out and you find something has gotten into your food stores. On those days, optimism is a practice you maintain the way you maintain the fire, not because it's natural, but because letting it go has consequences. Which brings us to routine, which sounds deeply unsexy as a psychological lifeline but turns out to be one of the most effective ones available. Structured, repeated activities, preparing meals at consistent times, maintaining hygiene, doing daily checks on the condition of your shelter and tools, actively scanning for any sign of rescue on a schedule, create what researchers call temporal anchors. They give shape to time. They divide the day into before and after, this morning and this afternoon, yesterday's check and tomorrow's check. They are in effect a calendar made of behaviour, and a person with a calendar is a person who has not entirely surrendered the concept of tomorrow. This is not about keeping busy for its own sake, or about the vague productivity guru notion that idle hands lead to trouble. It's specifically about preventing your sense of time from collapsing into the undifferentiated present that castaways describe as one of the most psychologically destabilizing features of extended isolation. When every day has a structure, every day is distinguishable from the one before it, and that distinction is load-bearing. Then there's the imagination piece, which may be the strangest and most underrated tool in the psychological survival kit. Castaways who made it through extended isolation frequently describe sustaining themselves through vivid mental connection to people they loved, to plans they intended to carry out when rescued, to futures they were determined to inhabit. Some describe it as mentally narrating their story to an imagined audience. Some describe conversations with people who weren't there. Some describe elaborate fantasies that had nothing to do with reality. Not delusional thinking, but deliberate escapism deployed strategically to give the mind somewhere to go besides the present crisis. Selkirk reportedly sang psalms and prayed aloud, partly for spiritual reasons and partly, one suspects, because hearing a human voice, even your own, in complete isolation is a reminder that you are still a person and not just a feature of the landscape. You're allowed to keep imaginary company. You're allowed to rehearse the meal you're going to eat when you get home in exhaustive detail, including what you're going to say when someone asks what you want for dessert. You're allowed to plan the extremely long and boring story you're going to tell at every social gathering for the rest of your life. These are not signs that the island has broken you. They are signs that you are actively refusing to let it. Now, the honest part. The Swedish analysis of 18 maritime disasters over more than a century put overall survival rates at around 40% for men and 30% for women, numbers that should give anyone pause and that reflect the reality that survival is not a guaranteed outcome even for people who do most things right. The island does not reward effort with proportional results. Rescue is contingent on factors entirely outside your control. Shipping lanes, search patterns, timing, and a fair amount of luck. You cannot think your way onto a passing ship. But here is what the data also shows, in the way that castaway accounts show it. The people who survived longest, who were found, or who found ways out, were almost uniformly people who maintained their sense of agency and refused to treat their situation as a closed question. Passivity shortens the timeline. Mental discipline extends it. That's not a guarantee. It's a tilt in the odds, and on an island where the odds are already not in your favour, a tilt matters. So the real lesson of all of this, the water collection and the fire building and the fish traps and the routines and the imaginary dinner conversations, is that survival is a three-part problem. It's part skill, which you can learn. It's part psychology, which you can practice. And it's part refusing, stubbornly, and sometimes absurdly, to mentally leave the island before your body does. If you found this useful, or if you're now anxious about boat trips in a way you weren't before, the subscribe button is right there. We'll be back next time with another scenario you definitely never thought about but probably should.